And from Delaware.
Mr. President, I rise this afternoon to share with you and our colleagues some of my thoughts concerning the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett to serve as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of these United States. I believe it was Winston Churchill who once said these words: the further back we look, the further forward we see. So let me begin today by looking back in time, way back in time. More than 230 years ago, during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, just up the road from my family's home in Wilmington, Delaware, our founders debated at great length on how to create a different kind of government, an experiment, if you will, in which a nation's citizens would elect their own leaders, and a system of checks and balances would ensure that country would never be led by a tyrant. Among the most contentious issues they debated during that summer of 1787 in the city of brotherly love was the creation of a federal judiciary. Our founders disagreed, oftentimes strongly, about what our judicial system should look like and how judges should be selected. Who would nominate them? Who would confirm them? Would they serve one term, multiple terms, or would their appointments be lifetime in nature? When the framers appeared to be hopelessly deadlocked, members of the clergy were brought in to pray that God would provide the leaders with the wisdom to break the impasse. In the end, it apparently worked. And our founding fathers ended up adopting a compromise very similar to one they had rejected just a few weeks earlier. Namely, the president would nominate judges to serve lifetime appointments with the advice and consent of the Senate. Not surprisingly, almost 240 years later, we are still sparring over what those words should mean. Having said that, the blueprint that was drafted that year and later ratified by the 13 states would go on to become the most enduring and replicated Constitution in the history of the world. Among our most important sworn duties here in the United States Senate is to act as caretakers of that Constitution and the rights it provides for our citizens, while protecting this unique system of checks and balances that provide the foundation on which our democracy is built. Mr. President, that brings us to the present. This past week, Republican members of the Senate Judiciary Committee voted to advance Judd Barrett's nomination to the floor of the Senate, but they have done so, I fear, at great cost to this body and quite possibly to our democracy. When our founders carefully designed our system of checks and balances, they did not envision a sham confirmation process for judicial nominees. But as much as I hate to say it, that's what this one has been, pure and simple. This entire process has become an exercise in raw political power, not the deliberative, nonpartisan process that our founders envisioned. Frankly, it's been a process that I could never have imagined 20 years ago when I was first elected to serve with my colleagues here. Over those 20 years, I've risen on 6 previous occasions to offer remarks regarding nominees to the Supreme Court as we consider the nominations of Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Alito, Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Kavanaugh. One name not mentioned under the 6 that I've just listed is that of Judge Merrick Garland. After being nominated by President Clinton to serve on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, that's a top appellate court in the country, and confirmed by a Republican-led Senate with a bipartisan margin of more than 3-1, 76 to 23, in fact, Judge Garland was served with distinction. Judge Garland has served with distinction on our top appellate court since 1997, including for many years as its chief judge. President Obama later nominated him to serve on the Supreme Court 237 days before Election Day in 2016. 237 days before Election Day. By submitting the name of Judge Garland to the United States Senate for consideration 4 years ago, President Obama, who was twice elected by clear margins in both the popular vote and the Electoral College, nominated a man who spent his entire 20-year career as a judge working to build consensus and find principled compromises. And yet we never got a chance to consider Judge Garland's nomination to serve on the Supreme Court on this Senate floor. Judge Garland wasn't given a vote either in committee or here in the United States Senate. Judge Garland wasn't given a hearing. Most of our Republican colleagues wouldn't even meet with him, even though many of them had voted earlier to confirm him to again serve on the top appellate court of our land. Judge Garland's nomination languished for 293 shameful days. A great many Americans believe that it's the equivalent of stealing a Supreme Court seat. A good man, a very good man, was treated badly, and so too was our Constitution. Still, many of our Republican colleagues assured us that if the tables were turned later on, they would hold themselves to the same standard and only allow the next president to fill a Supreme Court seat should a vacancy occur during an election year. And then on September 18, 2020, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, 46 days before a presidential election. And with her death, most of our Republican colleagues changed their tunes almost overnight. Today, with more than 220,000 Americans dead and more than 8 million Americans infected with coronavirus, not to mention 13 million unemployed, we are in the midst of an election, rushing to confirm a controversial nominee from President Trump, who lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes and was subsequently impeached by the House. Judge Barrett's nomination was rushed out of committee just 12 days before Election Day in a process that many believe was a clear violation of the rules of the Judiciary Committee. Think about that, 12 days. Instead of keeping their word, a number of our Republican colleagues are fast-tracking a nominee, and not a consensus nominee from the judicial mainstream like Judge Merrick Garland, as tens of millions of Americans are mailing their ballots in, dropping off their ballots, and lining up to vote. This confirmation process is shameful. It is unprecedented. If you've ever wondered what hypocrisy looks like, this is it. I know that many Americans, including many of our Republican colleagues, see in Amy Coney Barrett a well-qualified judge, and in Donald Trump a duly elected president. And they believe a vote is necessary because, after all, it's spelled out in the Constitution. But let me be clear. There is no precedent for the shameful blockade of consideration for Judge Merrick Garland. And there is no precedent for confirming Judge Barrett just 8 days before an election. As my colleagues know, I'm not given to hyperbole, but rushing to confirm Judge Barrett has the potential of altering, perhaps forever, the way the American people view the Supreme Court and the United States Senate. To our Republican friends, let me remind you that just because you can do this and get away with it doesn't make it right. This is wrong, and in your hearts, you know it's wrong. Your actions stand our system of checks and balances on its head. In the end, only serving to weaken our democracy, not strengthen it. To those Americans who want to see an up or down vote on Judge Barrett, I understand that you may not share my views or my fears, which many other people do share. But let me stop here for a moment here to share with you something that isn't widely known about most Republicans and most Democrats here in the United States Senate. While you'd never know it most days by watching the news, most of us who serve in this body generally get along. And while a lot has changed since Senators Pat Leahy and Chuck Grassley came here a long time ago, bipartisan friendships still endure, although they don't flourish as they once did. Many of us agree at times in hearing rooms, and many of us disagree at times in hearing rooms and on the Senate floor. But just about every week that we're in session, a number of Democrats and Republicans still find time together for prayer and reflection, whether at a prayer breakfast in the Capitol or one of the several bipartisan Bible study groups, including one led by our Senate chaplain, Barrett, who previously served as Chief of Chaplains for the Navy and the Marine Corps. Oftentimes at these gatherings, we are reminded of the Golden Rule, one of the two greatest commandments, to treat other people the way we want to be treated. After serving here for 20 years, I remain convinced that our friendships and our ability to reach consensus on critical issues facing our nation are based in no small part on our faithful adherence to that commitment, which can be found in every major religion of the world. And we are at our best here in this body when we follow it. I believe that true adherence to the Golden Rule calls for fairness in the way we discharge our constitutional responsibilities for judicial nominations too, including nominations to the Supreme Court, regardless of which party occupies the White House or the presiding officer's chair. We can't have one set of rules for Democratic presidents and another set of rules for Republican presidents. The Golden Rule called for a vote for Judge Garland. And I believe that today the Golden Rule calls for hitting the pause button on Judd Barrett's nomination until the president, who is elected in 9 days, is sworn into office. Why? Because the American people deserve to have their voices heard. But you don't have to take my word for this. Consider, if you will, the words of our Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, from March 2nd, 2016, 14 days before President Obama had even nominated Judge Merrick Garland to serve on the Supreme Court, following the death of Justice Scalia, and a whole 7 months before an election. Leader McConnell said 4 years ago, and I quote, "The American people deserve to be heard on this matter. That's the fairest and most reasonable approach today." He went on to say that voters have already begun to choose the next president, who in turn will nominate the next Supreme Court justice. This is something the American people should decide. That's what he said 4 years ago. Let's also listen to what the current chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Graham, told us March 10th, 2016. This is what he said, and I quote, "I want you to use my words against me." Think of that. I want you to use my words against me. If there's a Republican president elected in 2016 and a vacancy occurs in the last year of the first term, you can say, Lindsey Graham said, let's let the next president, whoever it might be, make that nomination. And finally, here's the advice of my friend, then chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Chuck Grassley, following the death of Justice Scalia. He said, and I quote, "The president should exercise restraint and not name a nominee until after the November election is completed." He went on to say, President Lincoln is a good role model for this practice. The president should let the people decide. Well, I'm glad Senator Grassley mentioned our nation's 16th president, because I believe President Lincoln's example will serve us well, especially at this moment. And why do I say that? Well, after a Supreme Court vacancy occurred just 27 days before the 1864 presidential election, what did President Lincoln do about it? Did he rush to fill the vacancy? Did he call on the Senate to push through a nominee in a month's time, largely because he could? No, he did not. And in the midst of a civil war that took the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans, Lincoln called for allowing the American people first to decide who would be president, and that person would then nominate a candidate for the vacant seat with the advice and consent of the Senate. Nearly 150 years later, Lincoln's words give us a clear roadmap for doing the right thing. Let the American people have their voices heard before filling this vacancy, instead of rushing it through just days before an election. As we all know, the Supreme Court seat we are debating today was left vacant by the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who served on the Supreme Court since 1993. We continue to mourn her loss. We continue to pray for her family and loved ones. Justice Ginsburg may have been small in stature, but in death, our nation has lost a true giant. Ruth Bader Ginsburg made it her life's work to challenge the laws and systems in this country that limited opportunity for women solely on the basis of their gender. She was a pioneer in her own right, but perhaps even more importantly, she paved the way for generations of women and girls who would come after her. Today, women can sign a mortgage on their own in no small part because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Today, women can open a bank account or apply for a credit card and without a male cosigner, in no small part because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And today, pregnant women cannot be discriminated against at work, in no small part because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I'm confident that her legacy will live on, especially in all the women and young girls she inspired throughout her remarkable life. But unfortunately, with her passing, the equality that she spent her life fighting for is now on the line. Many Americans believe in their hearts that the threats posed by this nominee, the one before us, at this moment, are real. That's particularly true when it comes to access to affordable health care, to the rights of women to make their own health care decisions, to voting rights, and perhaps most importantly, to the future of our planet. Mr. President, the Affordable Care Act hangs in balance with this nomination. Think about that for a moment. Right now, our country is in the midst of a public health crisis, the likes of which those of us living have never seen. Over 8 million of our fellow Americans have been infected with this coronavirus. Over 220,000 lives have been lost to this deadly virus. That's more than the entire population of Des Moines, Iowa. We are consistently seeing 700 Americans die from the coronavirus every day. The front page of yesterday's Wall Street Journal makes it clear. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. As it turns out, America has less than 5% of the world's population, but our country accounts for more than 20% of the world's deaths from coronavirus. No other nation on earth comes close to that. The numbers don't lie. Mexico, our neighbor to our south, has lost 88,000 people to the coronavirus. We've lost 220,000. The United Kingdom has lost 44,000. We've lost 220,000. France has lost 34,000. Germany, just over 10,000, and we have lost over 220,000. Canada, our neighbor to the north, has lost just over 9,000. Japan, 1,700 deaths. Australia, 905 deaths. South Korea, just 457 deaths for the coronavirus. And we have lost over 220,000. And while this carnage continues here and abroad, our friends in the other party continue to press the Supreme Court to throw out the Affordable Care Act in its entirety. Not next year, not next month. Meanwhile, nearly 13 million Americans are unemployed, and our unemployment rate at nearly 8% is more than double the rate from the beginning of this year. But rather than prioritize public health and long overdue relief for the millions of Americans who are struggling to get by, our Republican colleagues have instead decided to fast-track a Supreme Court nominee just 8 or 9 days before a presidential election. So why the rush? Well, to figure that out, all you have to do is look at a calendar. Just 7 days after Election Day on November 10th, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in a case known as California v. Texas. California v. Texas, a case that is brought by 18 Republican attorneys general and the Trump administration, seeks to overturn the Affordable Care Act in its entirety. In its entirety. If confirmed, Judge Barrett may well end up casting the deciding vote on whether or not to strike down the Affordable Care Act. And we know from her own words that Judge Barrett does not agree with the decision written by Chief Justice Roberts to uphold the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act a few years ago. She wrote that the Chief Justice had, and I quote, pushed the Affordable Care Act beyond its plausible meaning to save the statute, close quote. And Judge Barrett said nothing during her confirmation hearing to distance herself from these words. And what exactly could the consequences of overturning the ACA be? Well, for starters, those consequences could mean that nearly 135 million Americans who have a pre-existing condition could be charged more for health care, and in many cases, making their health care unaffordable. It could mean returning to a time when insurers could design plans that excluded coverage for contraception and family planning, as well as conditions like pregnancy and mental health care and substance abuse treatment. Overturning the Affordable Care Act could threaten Medicaid expansion that provides health care coverage to over 15 million low-income Americans, many of them living in some of the most rural parts of America. It would mean that young adults under the age of 26 may no longer be able to stay on their parents' health care plans. It would jeopardize the tax credit that over 9 million Americans receive to help cover their own health care costs. And that's just to name a few things, just a few. But make no mistake, overturning the Affordable Care Act in the middle of the night, in the middle of the worst pandemic in a century, will have devastating and far-reaching impacts on our health care system and nearly every American, including the more than 8 million Americans who will be left with a new pre-existing condition, the coronavirus. But sadly, that's what our president and many of our Republican colleagues are intent on doing as we battle COVID-19 every day and in every state of our country. Having failed nearly 100 times to repeal or chip away at the Affordable Care Act in Congress, Donald Trump and many of our Republican colleagues are now counting on the Supreme Court to do their work for them. And they are within one vote of achieving their goal. One vote. Mr. President, a woman's right to make her own personal and intimate health care decisions also hangs in the balance with this nomination. And during her confirmation hearing, Judge Barrett refused to say much of anything on this critical women's rights issue, including whether Roe versus Wade was correctly decided in 1973. Interestingly, though, she did cite Justice Ginsburg and the so-called Ginsburg rule and asserted that it prevented this nominee, from indicating how she would rule as a Supreme Court justice on these matters. But let's actually look at what Justice Ginsburg said about Roe versus Wade during her own confirmation hearing in 1993, 27 years ago. Justice Ginsburg said, and I quote, here's what she said: "The decision whether or not to bear a child is central to a woman's life, to her well-being and dignity. It is a decision she must make for herself. When government controls that decision for her, she's being treated as less than a fully adult human responsible for her own choices." Close quote. Justice Ginsburg did not deflect or refuse to answer the central question: should women have the right to make their own health care decisions? Justice Ginsburg was forthright, and the Senate confirmed her by a vote of 96 to 3. 96 to 3. Given Judge Barrett's lack of clarity on this critical matter, I am left to consider her past record and statements. My hope is that Judge Barrett would uphold nearly 50 years of precedence and maintain this constitutional right for women. However, my fear is that Justice Barrett was nominated because she meets Donald Trump's stated litmus test to overturn this constitutional right that an overwhelming majority of Americans support. Well, Mr. President, our presiding officer, voting rights and the integrity of our elections also hang in the balance with this nomination. Earlier this week, a deadlocked Supreme Court just barely upheld a Pennsylvania lower court decision that allows mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania to be counted in the upcoming election. The vote was tied 4-4, which means the issue is not settled permanently. It means that Judge Barrett may very well be the deciding vote on many disputes related to the upcoming election. How would Justice Barrett have ruled in the Pennsylvania case? Well, during her confirmation hearing, Judge Barrett refused to answer questions about the legality of poll taxes, voter intimidation, voter discrimination, and whether or not the president can unilaterally move Election Day. It strains credulity to believe that Judge Barrett does not know that poll taxes are unconstitutional, that voter intimidation is unconstitutional, that voter discrimination is unconstitutional, and that the president cannot move Election Day. And why can't he? Because you guessed it, because it would be unconstitutional, even if he tried. More than ever, we need justices on the Supreme Court, along with judges on other federal courts, who can be counted on by the American people to uphold the integrity of the upcoming election and on future elections. Based on her testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee earlier this month, I'm not sure that Judge Barrett can be counted on by the rest of us to ensure that, win or lose, President Trump stays within the boundaries of the law and abides by the will of the American voters on November 3rd. Well, as it turns out, there's a lot more than an election that may hang in the balance with this nomination, and that includes the very future of our planet and its inhabitants. Over the course of her confirmation hearing, on three separate occasions, Judge Barrett refused to acknowledge the plain and indisputable facts that climate change is real and the human activity is the primary, not the only, but the primary cause of our current climate crisis, which we see evidence of almost every single day. Hurricane-force winds pierced through America's heartland this summer, flattening a third of Iowa's crops in a matter of hours. Our East Coast and our Gulf Coast are experiencing one of the most active hurricane seasons ever recorded, with more tropical storms, more rainfall, and more rapid intensification. One of our colleagues from Louisiana told me last month that his state is losing the equivalent of one football field to the sea every 100 minutes. That's right. Not every week, not every month, not every day, every 100 minutes. The equivalent of one football field lost to the sea. Last summer, fueled by record heat, long droughts, and as many as 12,000 lightning strikes in 36 hours. Think of that, 12,000 lightning strikes in 36 hours. Wildfires destroyed parts of California the size of my state. This past week, Colorado has witnessed wildfire destruction that's almost as bad. And that's not all. This year, record-breaking heat waves simmered the coldest places on Earth, from Antarctica to the Arctic Circle, where the temperature reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit for the first time ever. That's right, 100 degrees Fahrenheit along the Arctic Circle. Temperatures in Alaska reached over 90 degrees Fahrenheit for the first time in that state's history. Temperatures in Death Valley reached over 134 degrees Fahrenheit, the hottest temperatures ever recorded on this planet. July was the hottest July ever recorded. September was the hottest September recorded. And on the heels of the hottest decade on Earth, this year is on track to be one of the hottest years ever recorded. This year. And it's not getting better. It's getting worse. And yet, when she was first asked simply if climate change was real, Judge Barrett responded that she is, and I quote, not a scientist, close quote. Well, Mr. President, I'm not a scientist either. I am, however, the senior Democrat on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And like millions of Americans, I recognize the simple fact that you don't have to be a scientist to trust scientists. You don't have to be entrenched in the studies of science to know that it's gravity which is keeping our feet firmly on the ground. When Judge Barrett was later asked by one of our colleagues whether coronavirus is infectious, Judge Barrett said, and I quote, "It's an obvious fact, yes." She was then asked if smoking causes cancer, and Judge Barrett said, quote, "Yes, every package of cigarettes warns that smoking causes cancer. But then when asked a third question, whether or not the nominee believed that climate change is happening and that is threatening the air we breathe, the water we drink, Judge Barrett refused to acknowledge the simple fact that climate change and global warming are real. Instead, Judge Barrett asserted that climate change is, quote, a contentious matter of debate. A contentious matter of debate, close quote. Well, Mr. President, climate change is not a contentious matter of debate. There's overwhelming consensus among the global scientific community that our planet is warming, and that warming is caused by carbon pollution, largely. Climate change is real. We see it every day in this country and every day on this planet. It's threatening the air we breathe and the water we drink. The American people and the people on our planet see the effects of climate change and global warming every single day. And these, Mr. President, are indisputable and undeniable facts, not a matter of debate. So Judge Barrett's views on climate change stand in stark contrast to the science and the views of the vast majority of the American people, too. They also stand in stark contrast to the views of the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Quite simply, Judge Barrett's views are out of touch with reality, and that poses a real threat to public health, to environmental quality, and I think the very future of this planet. Let me echo, if I may, the words of President Emmanuel Macron of France, who just down the hall here, the other end of the Capitol a couple of years ago, stood before a joint session of Congress, and he called for our country, the U.S., to once again lead the world on climate change. He reminded us, he said, we have only one planet. There's no planet B. No planet B. In fact, Mr. President, I fear there's never been more dangerous time to confirm a climate denier to a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court. And scientists warn that we are on the brink of irreversible planetary destruction if we do not begin to dramatically reduce global warming pollution. And over the next few decades, the Supreme Court will decide the fate of critical environmental issues, issues that will aid or drastically curtail the ability of future presidential administrations and Congresses to enact environmental policies that are essential to our survival as a planet. By way of contrast, Judge Barrett's predecessor, Justice Ginsburg, was a critical, tie-breaking vote on one of the most important climate change cases in the Supreme Court's history, called Massachusetts versus EPA. Recall with me, if you will, that Massachusetts versus EPA affirmed the Environmental Protection Agency's authority and duty to regulate tailpipe emissions of greenhouse gases as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. It also provided the legal underpinning for numerous other Obama administration climate regulations that the Trump administration has been hell-bent to destroy. And just as the Supreme Court was designed by our founders to remain above the political fray, our Supreme Court justices should not fall prey to the blatant misinformation at the heart of climate denial. Sadly, during her confirmation hearing, Judge Barrett demonstrated that on an issue so critical for the survival of our planet as we know it, she does not appear to be guided by science and is unlikely to be guided by the facts when it comes to global warming. And that, my friends, should scare the heck out of us. Mr. President, these issues that Justice Ginsburg fought so hard to protect over the course of her life, health care, the rights of women to make their own health care decisions, voting rights, and the future of our planet, hang in the balance with this nomination. And for these reasons, I will not be supporting the nomination of Judge Barrett. Mr. President, let me conclude, if I may, by noting that Justice Ginsburg did some of her most memorable work in dissent. During her memorial service in the U.S. Capitol, Justice Ginsburg's rabbi said, and I quote him, he said, "Justice Ginsburg's dissents were not cries of defeat, they were blueprints for the future," close quote. Justice Ginsburg knew that just because you don't have the votes doesn't mean you're any less right. Justice Ginsburg knew that a great dissent will speak to the future and just might eventually become the majority view. Today, we may not have the votes to stop this process or vote down this nominee, but that doesn't make our efforts to fight for fairness any less right. I could be mistaken, but I believe in my heart that the American people will make their voices heard loud and clear. What I believe is a sham of a confirmation process, and they'll do it on Election Day. Like Justice Ginsburg, the American people are dissenting against this process and against this nominee, and I believe they will be voting in record numbers. In fact, they already are. Judge Barrett may be confirmed, but let history show that I've tried hard both to follow the golden rule and the example of Justice Ginsburg, and that I refused to join the majority opinion. With that, Mr. President, I dissent. Post-cloture time to the Democratic leader. I yield my remaining post-cloture time to the Democratic leader.